Hello, I'm Krista Petley. I'm a professor of history at the University of Southampton, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Professor Mark Stoyle. Mark is a professor of early modern history. Much of his work has looked at the 17th century, including the English Civil War. But Mark also has a research and teaching interest in the earlier Tudor period, which is what we're going to talk about today. Mark, welcome. I'd like to start by just asking you what drew you to this period of history.
Well, I think the main thing, Krista, is that I actually grew up in the west of England, in Devon. So I grew up in rural Devonshire. And ever since I can remember, really, I've been aware of the fact that there was a very serious popular rising that took place in that district in the 1540s. And that was the Western Rising of 1549, sometimes known as the Prayer Book Rebellion. And it was fought out in the sort of the villages around where I grew up. Exeter, the capital city of the region of the southwest, that was the focus of a big siege during the Civil War. And in fact, I actually grew up in the village in which one of the great experts on the Prayer Book Rebellion, Professor Joyce Ewings, then lived. So ever since I can remember, I've been fascinated by this particular event.
Thanks, Mark. And it's actually rebellions that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about rebellions in response to an A-level exam question, which is, how serious a problem did popular risings pose to Tudor governments in the 1530s and beyond? So how serious a problem did popular risings pose to Tudor governments in the 1530s and afterwards? So the first thing, Mark, perhaps we could explore is, you've mentioned one rising, the Western Rising.
Yeah.
What sparks that rising? What causes it? And what causes these popular risings generally during the Tudor period?
Well, there's a whole series of risings during the 16th century, and they all have different causes. There are lots of different things going on, but I think historians mainly sort of divide them up into two or three sort of different categories, I suppose. There are some that are primarily caused by resistance to taxation. There are some that are caused by resistance to the process of enclosure, taking over sort of common land, if you like, and turning it into pasture land. And also increasingly, as the Tudor period goes on, there are risings which are really sparked off by resistance to the state's religious policies, and the Western Rebellion would certainly fall into that latter category.
So this is the period of the Reformation,
Yeah.
Of the break with Rome, and the establishment of a Protestant church in England.
Yeah.
And so amongst the other causes that you've mentioned, you feel that this is one of the major provocations for popular uprisings in the period.
I would say that's certainly the case, because really during the 16th century the traditional world is turned upside down. First Henry VIII and then his son Edward VI completely transform religious life in this country. It was probably one of the biggest sort of cultural revolutions that the country had seen for centuries, and obviously some people reacted to this with glee and excitement, and others with absolute horror. So it had the effect, I think, in many ways of polarising not just the country but individual regions of the country.
So this is England divided
Yes.
against itself.
And I mean, as you say, Krista, I've always been fascinated by the English Civil War, and I think in some ways those divisions that have always fascinated me in the 1640s you can also see in the 1540s. And in many ways I think it's hard for us to properly understand the English Civil War without understanding what happened during the Reformation period.
Okay, so these uprisings, a nation at odds with itself, particularly over the issue of the Reformation and all of the sweeping changes that is bringing to people's life, religious life, and also beyond their cultural life, because of course this is a people for whom religion is of central significance to their existence,
Yes.
their day-to-day life. Of all of these uprisings that we've talked about, which do you think is the most serious? Which one poses the greatest problem to Tudor government?
I mean, I think historians would give different answers to that question, but I guess the majority of people would agree that it's probably the Pilgrimage of Grace for the Commonwealth, which takes place in the north of England in 1536. This is normally seen as the biggest challenge, really, which is mounted to Henry VIII's Reformation, and it sees the whole of the north of England really rising in protest against what Henry's doing, specifically his attack on the monasteries, but also, of course, on his sort of gradual decoupling of England from Rome and assaults on all kinds kinds of traditional religious practices. And this event sees tens of thousands of men gathering in the north against Henry VIII and really threatening in many ways, I think, to force him to reverse those policies.
So Henry's break with Rome, his famous decision to establish the Church of England and break with Rome, helps to cause the Pilgrimage of Grace. How close does that come, do you think, to toppling Henry VIII? Is it ever a threat, do you think, to the monarchy itself, to the Tudor regime? I
mean, I think it certainly is, because the protesters cloak everything they're doing in the language of loyalty, and they stress that they're not hostile to the king. What they want to do is to get rid of the heretic ministers around him, who they believe are sort of lulling him into sort of false beliefs and forcing him to go down the route that he doesn't really want to take. And so this is, I suppose, one of the great problems, that the protesters either don't see that Henry himself is the real problem, or they're not prepared to actually accept that. And so that gives him a certain amount of wiggle room. And I mean, some scholars argue that, the protesters would never have actually got rid of Henry VIII himself. But I think it's arguable that if they had carried on south, if they'd moved out of the north, they'd moved into the more southern parts of the kingdom, I think more and more people might well have come in to join them. And then Henry would have been placed in a very unenviable position, either to give up his religious policies, which really he couldn't have done without being a lamed up king, or else actually have to confront these protesters in battle. And it's just not clear that he had enough troops to do that and win. So
it's something that could have become quite a close run thing.
Yes.
But Henry survives this rebellion. And continues to reign until 1547.
Yes.
And then he's replaced on the throne by his son, Edward VI. After Edward assumes the throne, do we see an end to these rebellions? Do these finish with Henry's rule, or do they continue?
No, I mean, they continue, and in many ways they become worse. I think that Henry, whatever his failings as a human being, he was an extremely strong and effective ruler. He'd kept a very, very tight grip on the country, but at the same time he'd left all sorts of problems for his son to inherit, not least of which was pretty much an empty treasury. And I think the other problem is that after Henry has died, the religious change actually intensifies. Edward actually is at the head of a regime which is definitely Protestant, and is pushing for sort of quite radically Protestant religious policies. That causes a great deal of unrest and unease in the country, and it's not long at all before further rebellions begin to break out.
Is it correct to say, Mark, that the young Edward is more ideologically Protestant than Henry? And is that, you're suggesting, one of the reasons for these particularly strong rebellions in his reign?
I mean, again, I think some historians believe that Edward is simply a puppet in the hands of sort of reformist nobles who are around him and sort of in control of the government. Others see him as himself much more ideologically committed, and I would tend to take the latter view. But I think what is clear is that the regime of which he's at least the titular head is certainly pushing in a much, much more radical direction than Henry's government had done, and it is pushing England to actually become a Protestant country.
So in these rebellions, the way that we've talked about them today, is what we're seeing, Mark, do you think, the sort of the last cries, the death cries of Catholic in England? Is that a way to think about them?
Yes. I mean, I think the last cries have all come a little bit later, perhaps in Elizabeth's reign. But I think what you're seeing here is a people in many ways who had been rather befuddled by what Henry VIII was doing. They hadn't known quite when to sort of to call time on it. They weren't sure when the king was going to stop, where he was going. I think many people in the 1540s, the late 1540s, say, well, enough is enough. We've clearly crossed a line here. Here we do have to stand up and fight for our sort of traditional beliefs. And it's clear that, as early as 1548, there's a serious rebellion in West Cornwall, where one of the royal commissioners, who's actually involved in acts of iconoclasm, is actually stabbed by a mob. That insurrection is quite quickly put down, but in the following year, in 1549, there are really very serious rebellions against religious change.
And who leads these rebellions? These are people uncomfortable with the direction that their country is taking, the direction that's being imposed from the centre by government, particularly on the question of religion. How do they happen? Are they spontaneous? Do they spark from below, ordinary people taking up arms and taking to the streets, or are they more orchestrated? Is it the priesthood, for example, who lead them?
Well, the government's view is very much that the rebellions which take place across the south and west of England are sort of clerically inspired, that they claim this is all the work of malign popish priests stirring up their sort of gullible parishioners to fight against these religious changes. I think the true position is more complicated. Yes, some priests did encourage their parishioners to protest. Some of them did actually become leaders, if you like, of these groups. But it's interesting that the very first protest that break out in 1549 in Devon, this is actually where a group of parishioners persuade their parish priest to abandon the new prayer book which the government's imposed on them, to put back on his old clerical vestments which the government had outlawed, and to say the old service again. So there you can see much more, I think, as you said, Krista, it seems to be almost a bottom-up process, that ordinary people are actually compelling clergymen who are perhaps reluctantly going along with the government's orders to resist them. And I think it's really a mixture. I think there are some priests who are leaders, there are some ordinary people who are leaders, yeomen, artisans and so forth. There also seem to be some gentlemen, a few are actually engaged in the rebellions, actually serve as leaders. Others seem to have stood back but to be quietly sort of encouraging it from the sidelines. So all sorts of different groups seem to be involved.
So there's a real political fervour at this time, and a real political division across the country, framed by this question of the break with Rome and what should happen to religious life.
That's it. There's a bitter ideological split, I would say, between reformers and anti-reformists, and there are also other very interesting divisions going on in 1549, Krista, because whereas in Oxfordshire, say, here in Hampshire, in the West Country, you have groups of rebels rising up who are determined to sort of preserve the old faith and to fight against Protestantism. At this very same time, in East Anglia and parts of Kent, you've got other groups of rebels rising up who don't seem to be pursuing a sort of religiously conservative agenda. They're much more concerned about economic issues, about enclosure, about injustices that they feel are being done to them by local governors. So there's this fascinating sort of spectacle, really, of all sorts of different rebellions taking place across England at the same time. There are interlinking factors that sort of connect them, but in other ways they're very different too.
So this is a world undergoing change on so many levels. Not just politically and ideologically with the Reformation, but also economically with enclosure and the other factors that you mentioned. And it sees these uprisings that you've described. If we could go back to the question which we started with, which is how serious a problem did these popular risings pose to Tudor governments in the 1530s and in the 1540s? Summarising what you've talked about, how serious were they? How close did they come, do you think, to toppling Henry? You've talked a bit about that, and then his son Edward from the throne.
Well, I think that you could really say something rather different about each of them. I think the Pilgrimage of Grace, that protest, is hugely significant because large numbers of gentry and some nobility as well take part in it. And that means that the protesters have large bodies of men, very large bodies in the thousands, who are well armed, well horsed, well equipped, well led. They could really have posed a huge challenge to Henry if it had come to outright warfare between the two sides. I think in 1549 things are very different. The risings that take place in East Anglia, around London, in Kent, in many ways those groups of protesters are not so much protesting against the government as against local misgovernment. And they seek to align themselves, in certain respects at least, with the government of Protector Somerset. So I don't think they're posing quite such an existential threat, if you like, to the regime. But I think the Western rebels in Devon and Cornwall do pose a much more serious threat. They're absolutely against what the government is doing. They're absolutely against those who are actually powerful around the throne. I think if that rebellion had rolled westwards, had taken in counties like Dorset, Somerset, here in Hampshire, where there's lots of religious conservatism. I think if that had sort of swelled into a really serious, large-scale rebellion, and that had arrived at the gates of London, it's fascinating to see what might have happened. I cannot see how the Western protesters, who are absolutely determined to stop the Reformation, I can't really see how they could have come to any compromise with Edward's government. And I think at that stage it would have come to sort of an all-out battle at the gates of London, or actually there is, I think, a real possibility they could have toppled the king. I think what makes that less likely is that they probably just don't have the military force to achieve it. They would have needed much larger numbers of troops. They would have needed more well-trained, well-armed men. And in the end, Edward's government is able to put the Western rebels down, partly through deploying gentry retinues, but also through deploying large numbers of foreign mercenary soldiers.
Thank you, Mark. So we have two rebellions, the Pilgrimage of Grace and the Western Rebellion, which were very serious threats potentially to the government, but that never actually got to the stage where it was touch and go.
That would be my view.
For the future of the regime.
Yes.
Mark, thank you. That's been fascinating. A real insight into the Tudor period through the lens of these rebellions. Thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure, Krista. It's been great fun to talk about it.